You're all welcome to this next PowerPoint series on the pursuit of sovereignty and impact of partition section from Leaving Cert History. In this discussion today and over the next few clips, we're going to be looking at the impact of World War II, or the emergency as it was known as in the South, and also then looking at the North as well between the period 1939-45 and thereafter. So we're going to start this session today, first of all, by looking at past exam questions, and then we'll kind of lead into the introduction on this as well, and go from there, looking at the Declaration of Neutrality in the South, and the whole issue of defence for the Irish Army, and also perhaps the IRA threat. And then in subsequent episodes, we're going to look at things like the whole area of censorship, the war economy in the South, relations with Britain, Germany, America, the end of the war. And then later on, we will look also at the impact of World War II up in the North, and with a specific focus on the case study that is Belfast during World War II. Looking to past exam questions first of all, and as you can see in 2019, there was a question there: what was the impact on Northern Ireland of the world economic crisis, or the interwar period, I should say, and or World War II? Now, I mean, the economic crisis during the interwar period, I suppose that would be a little reference to things like the Wall Street crash and the impact of that on the northern economy. It might be a paragraph you might want to put in, or you could just focus on the impact of Northern Ireland and I suppose the whole impact of World War II specifically. And that's pretty much what we'll be looking at in today's discussion. And the big chunk of that, of course, would be the whole area of Belfast during World War II, but it wouldn't be the only part of it. And that's something that we will deal with later on when we get into the whole area of that particular case study itself. Okay, then you can see in 2018 there's a question: during the period 22 to 45, how effective were the governments of both Cosgrave and De Valera in dealing with threats to security of the state? Now, this is something that I've mentioned in the previous shows on Fianna Fáil between 32 and 39, and the Common Gael governments between 22 and 32. And here, I suppose, part of that essay would be maybe a paragraph or so on the whole impact of World War II and the impact, I suppose, it was having on the whole issue of threats to security. And we'll be dealing with that probably, I suppose, in this first video here today. Going back to 2017 then, a very straightforward question: what was the impact of World War II in Ireland, North and South? Now, you need to be careful here. And or gives you the option to focus on one or the other. Where it says North and South, you have to mention both. Now, it doesn't have to be a 50-50 discussion on both. It could very much be tilted towards one, but you would need to mention the other as well. So if you're very much going into that exam, we'd say Northern Ireland, the whole Belfast during World War II, Belfast Blitz, whatever you want to call it, that could be a big part of your essay, but you'd also have to put in some bit about the emergency in the South. Likewise, if you went to the exam very kind of geared towards a question on De Valera and neutrality in World War II, even if you had a paragraph on the North at the end or something, that would suffice, but you have to mention both when it says and. When it says and or, you have the choice to write about both or one of them, and that's very important to stress. 2016, then you can see a question on Irish governments and the impact on society and economy between 23 and 45. Again, maybe a paragraph or so on the wartime economy would be sufficient there. So it's only part of the question, and obviously a main focus there beyond the Common Gael and Fianna Fáil governments and their economic and social policy between 23 and 32 and 32 to 39, but you'd have to give some paragraph or so on wartime economics as well. There are no questions from 2014 and 2015 because this section was the documents-based question those years. So the only gap you can see is 2013. And again, in 2012, there's a question then very much geared towards Northern Ireland. How did the government of Northern Ireland deal with economic problems and or threats to security between 1920 and 45? So here you would have to have some knowledge of the Northern Ireland chapter as well. That would be, I suppose, the foundation of the Northern Ireland state, 1920, the James Craig period itself, and maybe elements about security there, the establishment of the RUC, sectarian violence, etc. And then a big chunk of your essay could go into World War II, certainly, but it wouldn't be the only part of the essay. Likewise, you might want to marry in a paragraph or two on the economic problems facing the North, but again, a big part of that could be Northern Ireland during World War II as well. 2011 then, another question revolving around Northern Ireland. What was the impact on Northern Ireland of international developments during the period 32 to 45? And really the international developments are the global economic crisis following the Wall Street crash. So even if you had a paragraph on that and then the rest on World War II, that would certainly suffice there. I think if you just went in and wrote just about World War II, you might suffer somewhat in the overall evaluation for not giving a full span of the question, i.e. going from 1932 onwards. And then we're going back to 2007. Okay, a bit of a strangely worded question. Following the experience of war, to what extent was Belfast in 1945 different to 1939? That's very much geared towards the case study there. Of course, you can see Belfast during World War II, and I'll be looking at that in one of the later videos as we go through this. And then the very first year of the course, the new course, was 2006. How well did Ireland North and or South, so you have the option here on either or both, deal with the social and economic problems presented by World War II. So if you were going in with De Valera there, for example, you could certainly write a good essay there. Or if you were going in with the Northern Ireland case study, as in Belfast during World War II, that would form a big chunk of the essay. Or if you knew a bit about both, ideally you could write about both and then have a very good piece of work as well. So we'll come back to these past exam questions in the last video we do on this section, just to recap and review on what had come up. So we'll get started and I'm going to focus over the next few videos specifically on the South. So this is basically De Valera, the policy of neutrality during World War II, or as was known here as the emergency. So just be careful of that word in case it ever came up in an exam on the emergency. That is specifically the South during World War II. Okay, so we're going to focus on this period from 1939 to 45, although technically speaking, I think the emergency was still there up until 1947 with things like rationing, etc. Okay, so as we mentioned in the Fianna Fáil chapter, the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and we said that was a huge, huge success for De Valera, both personally and politically. And one of the main parts of that was the whole area of defence, the defence agreement, which basically gave us back the treaty ports of Lough Swilly, Bearhaven and Queenstown, or is now known as Cove. These were the three ports the British Navy had been occupying even after independence in 1921. But by 1938, April of that year, the then British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain decided to with De Valera, and it was a concession that in the hope of a future war that was going to happen in Europe, that the Irish would perhaps play ball and assist the British with their self. So Chamberlain was scolded by some for giving this concession to the Irish, most notably by Winston Churchill, but he did, and the timing was perfect because when war was declared in September 1939, Ireland was definitely then in a position to be in charge of its own destiny. And on the 3rd of September 1939, World War II officially began, and De Valera immediately announces a policy of neutrality. And that is the key word in this entire chapter here, folks, neutrality. And we'll be looking at that now for the next 6 years beyond. So he goes into the Dáil the previous day, and he passes two Dáil bills, the first amendment to the Constitution in 1937, which formally declares a state of emergency, giving the Irish government of the day special powers necessary in relation to things like the economy, defence, censorship, etc. The Emergency Powers Bill gave the government a broad range of powers that might arise or to deal with issues that might arise during wartime, and also the establishment of the Department of Supplies was set up as well, as took up the role of Minister for Supplies. De Valera felt this was necessary in this state of emergency. Jerry Boland took over in the position of Department of Justice. Frank Aiken was appointed Minister for Coordination of Defence Measures, and he was essentially in charge of censorship, something that we look at in a later video. And also Oscar Traynor moved to defence, and as I mentioned a moment ago, Sean Lemass took over in the post of Minister for Supply. So these are the key figures in this essay. Should you get a question about World War II in the South, you will need to mention all of the above names really for various different paragraphs. So the Dáil then pretty much enacted necessary legislation. Pretty much most people were in agreement with this. One or two, all right, within Fine Gael, including James Dillon, the leader, was critical of it, as he felt that it was necessary to be part of the Allied war effort against Hitler. But he was a relatively lone voice in that. And Ireland would pretty much adopt a neutral stance throughout the war, although from 1941-42 onwards, you do see a slip towards what we call friendly neutrality. We'll discuss that later on, or an neutral stance, whereby they were certainly favouring Britain and America with relation to certain matters like meteorological or weather reports, airspace, etc. And we'll talk about that probably in the next video. All right, so on the 2nd of September 1939, the Irish Army was very, very small at 19 plus thousand regulars. So I suppose in this paragraph here now, folks, we're moving on to the first main issue, and that would be the whole area of defence. So if you've got a question, something like, to what extent was the Irish government successful in its handling of affairs during World War II, or something like that, after introductory paragraph, which is basically on the declaration of neutrality, you might want to then focus on defence. And as you can see here, the army itself was quite a small force, and this course came after the downsizing of the army from the Cumann Gael period. When they first came in, the Irish army was at 52,000, and by 1939 it was just under 20,000 in total. So it was very, very, we were in no position to defend against any real attack. As you can see, the army was very small, about 5 infantry battalions, a field battery of artillery, an armoured car squadron, which was minuscule to say. There was also a number of engineers, construction and maintenance companies, a few transport companies, and even a horse squadron and cyclist squadron. So you can imagine any possible attack from a German blitzkrieg or something like that, pretty much open to any form of attack with very, very little defence in place. And in fact, the government expenditure on defence was minimal compared to, we'd say, other neutral countries. I think it was about 2 or 3% of GDP was spent on defence, whereas a comparison like Switzerland or Sweden were spending up to 20 or 30% on their defence during World War II. So we basically took a punt on this, that it was not worth spending money on defence. Okay, and as I said, this did cause certain concerns within the military, but De Valera felt it was something that we would pretty much have no chance anyway in the event of invasion. So with the small attempts to deal with this, though, there was a renewed emphasis on the role of the local defence forces, the LDF. These were kind of a dad's army, basically, kind of part-time people involved that were, going to try and, I suppose, prepare us for any form of attack. But really, as I said, minuscule funding and virtually zero involved in that. And you can see a picture there of De Valera inspecting the local defence forces just outside the GPO on some parade at this particular time itself. So luckily for us, after 1941, with the failed Battle of Britain for Hitler, he makes the, I suppose, ultimately catastrophic decision to focus his attention on the east towards Russia and split his forces and head in towards Operation Barbarossa. And that, I suppose, kind of takes the pressure off us somewhat then in terms of defending us from possible Nazi attack. And as a result, expenditure was kept very, very low for the defence during the war itself. And that saved us then from massive post-war debts that maybe other countries had as a result of such high, heavy military expenditure during the war. Okay, so I think we're going to pause here now, and we're going to continue on in the next video with the IRA threat neutrality. We're going to focus on the position of Germany and Ireland, the British and Ireland, and hopefully as well we'll get to America. But as I said, there's a number of videos in this particular topic. So we'll leave it there and join us again for part 2.